They laughed at the Americans dying in the snow. German officers stood around their maps in warm headquarters, drinking coffee, mocking the 10,000 United States soldiers trapped in Bastogne. "They're finished," one Wehrmacht commander said with a smile. "In 3 days, maybe 4, they'll all be dead or prisoners. The Americans don't know how to fight in winter." The date was December 22nd, 1944. Inside the frozen hell of Bastogne, ammunition was running out. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded men lay in makeshift hospitals with no morphine to ease their agony. The temperature had dropped to -7 degrees Celsius. Snow fell endlessly. German artillery shells crashed into the town every few minutes, turning buildings into rubble and soldiers into casualties. The situation was beyond desperate. It was hopeless. Every military expert agreed no relief force could possibly arrive in time. The weather had grounded all aircraft. The roads were death traps of ice and German ambushes. The distance was too far, the obstacles too many. Bastogne would fall, and 10,000 American lives would be extinguished in the Belgian snow. But there was one man the Germans hadn't counted on. One man who heard the word impossible and treated it like a personal insult. General George Smith Patton. The man they called Old Blood and Guts. This is the true story of how Old Blood and Guts turned the Germans' greatest victory into their most crushing defeat. How he did what every expert said couldn't be done. How he saved 10,000 lives and changed the course of the Second World War in just 72 hours. This is what happened when the Germans stopped laughing. George Smith Patton was 59 years old that winter, but he had the energy and aggression of a man half his age. Born into military aristocracy in 1885, he had spent his entire life preparing for one moment, the moment when everything would depend on his ability to lead soldiers into impossible situations, and somehow emerge victorious. They called him Old Blood and Guts because he led from the front lines, not from comfortable headquarters. While other generals studied maps and chateaus miles behind the fighting, Patton rode in open jeeps through enemy fire, visiting his troops, sharing their danger, earning their absolute loyalty. He wore ivory-handled pistols on his belt. He delivered profanity-laced speeches that made soldiers ready to charge through hell itself. He was flamboyant, controversial, and utterly fearless. He was also the most brilliant tactical commander in the United States Army. By December of 1944, Patton's Third Army had already carved a legendary path across Europe. After breaking out of Normandy in July, his forces had advanced 600 miles in 4 months, liberating thousands of square miles of France and capturing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general. They called him Der Bluthund, the Bloodhound, because once he had your scent, he never stopped hunting. But in December, Patton's advance had slowed to a brutal crawl. His Third Army was engaged in savage fighting around Metz and in the Saar region, preparing to smash into Germany's industrial heartland. Supply shortages plagued every unit. Winter weather turned roads into frozen nightmares. The war that everyone thought would end by Christmas was dragging into a frozen, bloody stalemate. Then came December 16th, 1944. In the pre-dawn darkness, Adolf Hitler launched his final desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine. 250,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks erupted from the Ardennes forest, slamming into thinly defended United States positions with devastating force. The attack achieved complete surprise, total shock. American units, many composed of inexperienced troops, resting in what they thought was a quiet sector, were overwhelmed in minutes. German armored spearheads raced westward, tearing a massive bulge through Allied lines. Entire United States regiments were surrounded, shattered, or forced into chaotic retreat. Communication networks collapsed. Headquarters lost contact with frontline units. Panic spread through the American command structure. For the first time since D-Day, the specter of defeat loomed over the Allied armies. Hitler's plan was audacious in its scope and desperation. Drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and United States forces completely. Force the Allies to negotiate peace in the West, so Germany could concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviets advancing from the East. It was Germany's last chance to avoid total destruction, And for 3 days, it looked like the plan might actually work. By December 19th, German forces had penetrated nearly 30 miles into Belgium. They had captured thousands of American prisoners. They controlled key road junctions and were racing toward the Meuse River bridges. Most critically, they had completely surrounded the town of Bastogne, trapping the 101st Airborne Division and elements of several other units inside. Bastogne was the key to everything. 7 major roads converged on this small Belgian town. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed those roads desperately to supply their advancing spearheads. The Americans needed to hold Bastogne to prevent total catastrophe. Inside the surrounded town, 10,000 United States soldiers prepared to fight to the death. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the desperate defense. His men had almost no winter clothing. Ammunition was rationed. Food supplies would last perhaps 3 more days. Medical facilities overflowed with wounded who couldn't be evacuated. German artillery pounded the town constantly. Panzer tanks prowled the perimeter, probing for weaknesses. On December 22nd, German officers arrived under a white flag with an ultimatum. The message was clear: surrender now or be annihilated. The weather had grounded Allied aircraft, so no supplies could be dropped. No relief force could possibly arrive through the German lines. Resistance was futile. General McAuliffe's one-word response became legendary: nuts! The German officers were confused. What does this mean? They asked. It means go to hell, the American messenger explained. The Germans returned to their lines, shaking their heads. These Americans were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Either way, they would all be dead within days. The Wehrmacht tightened the noose around Bastogne and prepared for the final assault. But 70 miles to the south, Old Blood and Guts had already set his impossible plan in motion. The critical moment had come 3 days earlier, December 19th, at the emergency conference in Verdun. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had summoned his top generals to address the crisis. The atmosphere was tense. Staff officers spoke in worried whispers. Maps covered with red enemy arrows showed German penetrations driving deeper into Allied territory hour by hour. Eisenhower opened the meeting with deliberate optimism. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. Most of the generals looked skeptical. They saw disaster everywhere they looked. But General George Smith Patton was grinning like a wolf that had just spotted wounded prey. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris," Old Blood and Guts said with characteristic audacity. "Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." Eisenhower wasn't amused. The situation was too desperate for Patton's bravado. "George, that's fine, but the immediate problem is Bastogne. We need to relieve that garrison before the Germans overrun it." Then came the question that would echo through military history. When can you attack north with at least 6 divisions? The room went silent. Every general understood the magnitude of what Eisenhower was asking. Patton's Third Army was currently engaged in heavy combat over 100 miles south of Bastogne. His forces were scattered across a wide front, attacking toward Germany. His supply lines were stretched thin. His troops were exhausted from months of continuous fighting. The weather was the worst in decades. The roads were sheets of ice. Turning an entire army 90 degrees, disengaging from current operations, marching over 100 miles through winter storms, and launching a coordinated attack into the strongest part of the German offensive would normally require 3 weeks of careful planning and preparation. Patton looked at his eye watch. On December 22nd, with 3 divisions, the other generals stared at George Smith Patton as if he had lost his mind. 72 hours, 3 divisions, 100 miles through the worst winter in living memory. Attack directly into the flank of the German offensive at its strongest point. It was insane, impossible, militarily absurd. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior and longtime friend, shook his head. "Don't be fatuous, George." Other commanders muttered in disbelief. Staff officers exchanged skeptical glances. Everyone in that room had spent their careers studying military logistics and operational planning. What Old Blood and Guts was proposing violated every principle in every textbook ever written about moving armies. But Eisenhower studied Patton's face carefully. He had known George Smith Patton for decades. He knew that beneath the flamboyant showmanship and profane bravado was a military mind of genuine genius. "How soon? Can you get started?" Eisenhower asked. "I've already started," Patton replied. This was the moment that revealed the true brilliance of old blood and guts. While other commanders were still trying to comprehend the magnitude of the German attack, Patton had been thinking 3 steps ahead. His intelligence officers had noticed unusual enemy activity in the Ardennes days before the offensive began. They couldn't predict exactly what the Germans were planning, but Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans just in case. 3 separate operational plans, actually. Each one detailed how to rapidly disengage from current operations, wheel the Third Army 90 degrees north, and attack into different sectors of the Ardennes. All Patton had to do was select which plan to execute and give the code word. "I'll attack on the morning of December 22nd with the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry." "Division," Patton continued. "We'll hit them right here." He jabbed his finger at the map, indicating the southern shoulder of the German Bulge near Bastogne. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking and terrifying. Moving a single division while in contact with the enemy is one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. Disengaging from combat, turning 90 degrees, marching over 100 miles, and attacking again requires perfect coordination of thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of men, and hundreds of tons of supplies. Traffic jams can paralyze the entire operation. Units can get lost. Communications can break down. Supply lines can collapse. Now multiply that difficulty by 3 divisions. Add brutal winter weather that turned every road into a skating rink. Include the fact that German forces would certainly detect the movement and attempt to disrupt it. Factor in exhausted troops who had been fighting continuously for months. Any one of 1,000 things could go wrong, probably would go wrong, but George Smith Patton had absolute confidence in his Third Army and even more confidence in himself. The Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder, Old Blood and Guts said with savage satisfaction. "And this time, I've got hold of the handle." Eisenhower made his decision. "Go ahead, George. I'll give you everything I've got to support you." Patton stood, saluted, and strode out of the conference room. As soon as he was outside, he called his headquarters and spoke 2 words: "Play ball." Those 2 words activated Operation Overturn, the pre-planned contingency that Patton's staff had prepared. Within minutes, the entire Third Army began one of the most complicated military movements in history. Over 133,000 vehicles started their engines. Supply convoys began moving 62,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and food north. 3 entire divisions, representing over 60,000 combat soldiers, disengaged from their current operations and began the grueling march toward Bastogne. The German High Command couldn't believe what they were seeing. Wehrmacht intelligence officers reported massive American troop movements south of the Bulge, but the reports seemed impossible. "The Americans cannot possibly disengage, reposition, and attack that quickly," one German general insisted. "It takes weeks to move an army. This must be a mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. It was George Smith Patton doing what he did better than any commander in the war, attacking with speed, violence, and absolute determination. The conditions his soldiers faced were beyond brutal. This was the coldest winter in European memory. Temperatures hovered around -7 degrees Celsius, but wind chill made it feel far colder. Snow fell constantly, reducing visibility to a few yards. The roads weren't cleared because nobody had expected to move entire divisions through them in the middle of winter during active combat operations. United States soldiers wore standard cotton field jackets and wool overcoats, designed for autumn weather, not Arctic conditions. They didn't have the proper winter gear that would have been issued if anyone had anticipated fighting in these temperatures. Men's hands froze to their weapons. Engines seized up and had to be started every 30 minutes, or the oil would turn to sludge. Frostbite casualties began mounting even before the first shots were fired. But Old Blood and Guts had prepared for more than just the logistics. He understood that winter combat was as much a psychological battle as a physical one. Soldiers fighting in miserable conditions, exhausted and scared, needed to see their commander sharing their suffering. They needed to know that the man ordering them forward wasn't sitting in some comfortable headquarters sipping hot coffee. So, Patton made himself visible. He rode in an open jeep despite the freezing temperatures. He visited unit after unit, often arriving at frontline positions that were still under enemy fire. His face was weathered and raw from the cold, but he refused any concession to comfort. Soldiers saw him and spread the word. Old Blood and Guts is up there with us. The old man's freezing his ass off just like we are. The psychological effect was immense. When soldiers are cold, hungry, scared, and exhausted, seeing their commander enduring the same hardships creates a bond that no amount of orders or discipline can match. George Smith Patton knew this instinctively. He had studied military history his entire life, reading about Alexander the Great, sleeping on the ground with his soldiers, about Napoleon sharing his men's dangers at the Bridge of Arcole, about Robert E. Lee riding among his troops during the worst fighting. Patton believed he was the reincarnation of those great commanders. And in moments like this, he fought and led like them. We're not just going to rescue those poor bastards in Bastogne, Patton told his assembled division commanders on the evening of December 19th. We're going to rip the guts out of the entire German offensive. We're going to attack so hard and so fast that the Krauts won't know what hit them. And when this is over, the Germans will never laugh at the United States Army again. His commanders believed him. More importantly, they believed in him. General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division that would spearhead the attack, nodded grimly. We'll get to Bastogne, General, or die trying. You'll get there, Patton said with absolute certainty. Because failure is not an option. Those men are depending on us. But even as Patton's forces began their northward march, the situation in Bastogne deteriorated by the hour. German attacks intensified. Artillery fire increased. Ammunition stocks dwindled to critical levels. The wounded multiplied faster than the overwhelmed medical staff could treat them. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day, then 1 meal every 2 days. On December 21st, the weather briefly cleared enough for a single supply drop. Transport aircraft braved German anti-aircraft fire to drop containers of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Some parachutes drifted into German lines. Others landed in minefields. But enough reached the defenders to buy them another day of survival. One more day for Old Blood and Guts to arrive. On the night of December 21st, Patton did something that would become legendary. He summoned his chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, to his headquarters. "Chaplain, I want you to write a prayer for good weather," Patton said. "I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can't get God to work on our side for a change." O'Neill was startled. "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." "I don't care if it takes the flying carpet from the Arabian Nights," Patton snapped. "I want the praying done." The chaplain composed a prayer that was printed and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee that, armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish Thy justice among men and nations. Amen." Whether through divine intervention or simple meteorological chance, the weather began to clear on December 23rd, and that's when George Smith Patton's Third Army struck with the fury of an avenging angel. December 22nd, 1944, 0300 hours. The temperature was minus 10 degrees Celsius. Along a 20-mile front south of Bastogne, 3 United States divisions lurched into motion through the frozen darkness. This was the moment when Old Blood and Guts' impossible promise would either become legendary reality or catastrophic failure. The 4th Armored Division led the assault. These were veteran tank crews who had fought across France, men who trusted their commander absolutely. Behind them came the 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division, composed largely of National Guard troops from New England who had learned to be warriors through months of brutal combat. On the left flank, the 80th Infantry Division, the Blue Ridge Division, moved into position. 60,000 combat soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, all driving north through a frozen hell toward 10,000 surrounded men who were running out of time. The Germans never expected it. They had assumed that winter weather and logical military planning would require weeks before any serious counterattack could be mounted. They had positioned their forces to continue driving west toward Antwerp, not to defend against a massive assault from the south. They were about to learn what happened when you underestimated George Smith Patton. The initial attack caught German forces completely off guard. 4th Armored Division's Combat Command B, spearheaded by Sherman tanks and tank destroyers, smashed into German defensive positions with such speed and violence that entire enemy units disintegrated before they could establish coherent defensive lines. Villages that the Germans had occupied for days were liberated in hours. But this wasn't going to be easy. The Wehrmacht, even in its declining state, remained a formidable fighting force. German commanders quickly recovered from their initial surprise and rushed reinforcements to block Patton's advance. Elite Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions, some of the best remaining units in the German army, were thrown into the battle. The countryside around Bastogne became a frozen battlefield of incredible savagery. Tank battles erupted across snow-covered fields. German Tiger and Panther tanks, with their superior armor and guns, dueled with American Shermans that were outmatched in direct combat, but superior in numbers and crew training. Villages changed hands multiple times in brutal house-to-house fighting. Artillery from both sides turned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. United States soldiers fought with desperate determination. They knew that 10,000 of their brothers were trapped in Bastogne, depending on them. They knew that Old Blood and Guts was watching, expecting, demanding that they overcome every obstacle. And they knew that failure meant not just military defeat, but the death of everyone surrounded in that town. George Smith Patton was everywhere. He seemed to possess supernatural energy during those critical days. He visited forward, command posts under German artillery fire. He drove to battalion headquarters to personally congratulate soldiers who had captured key objectives. He relieved commanders who weren't attacking aggressively enough and replaced them with officers who would. His presence was felt at every level of the Third Army. "Drive forward!" he shouted to tank commanders. "Don't stop for anything. The men in Bastogne are counting on us." One United States tank commander later recalled, "We'd be pinned down by German fire, thinking we couldn't advance another yard. Then Old Blood and Guts would appear out of nowhere, standing in his Jeep like he didn't even notice the shells exploding around him. He'd point toward the German positions and yell, 'What the hell are you waiting for? Attack!' And we'd attack, because if the old man could stand there under fire without flinching, we could damn well get our tanks moving. But the advance was agonizingly slow, not because of lack of courage or effort, but because of the brutal realities of winter warfare and German resistance. The 4th Armored Division, which needed to cover less than 25 miles to reach Bastogne, found every mile contested. German forces blew bridges. They established strong points in villages. They positioned anti-tank guns in hidden positions along the roads. They counterattacked with their remaining armor. And winter itself fought against the Americans. Tanks threw their tracks on icy roads. Vehicles broke down in the extreme cold. Frostbite casualties mounted. Soldiers who sweated during combat operations found their uniforms freezing to their bodies when they stopped moving. Weapons jammed. Radio batteries died in the cold. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew more desperate by the hour. The 101st Airborne and attached units were being ground down by constant German attacks. On December 23rd, German forces launched a major assault against the western perimeter of the town, penetrating deep into American defensive positions before being thrown back in vicious close-quarter combat. General McAuliffe knew his men couldn't hold out much longer. Ammunition was almost gone. Artillery shells were being rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies were exhausted. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia. Wounded men lay in freezing cellars with only thin blankets for warmth. But McAuliffe also knew that George Smith Patton was coming. Everyone in Bastogne knew. Word had spread through the ranks that Old Blood and Guts himself was leading the relief force. If any man in the United States Army could do the impossible, it was Patton. "Hold on," McAuliffe told his exhausted commanders. "Georgie's coming. We just have to hold on a little longer." On December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. Brilliant winter sunshine illuminated the snow-covered landscape. It was the first clear weather in over a week, and it changed everything. Patton's prayer had been answered. Within hours, the skies filled with Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers descended on German positions like birds of prey. They strafed German columns. They bombed strongpoints. They attacked tanks and artillery positions. Supply aircraft dropped desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food into Bastogne. The psychological effect on both sides was enormous. American soldiers looked up at hundreds of friendly aircraft and felt hope surge through their frozen bodies. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to Allied air superiority, but hadn't faced it for over a week due to the weather, felt despair. George Smith Patton stood outside his headquarters, watching the aircraft overhead, and spoke to his chaplain. "Hot dog, chaplain, that's a dandy prayer. You sure standing good with the Lord and the soldiers." He later awarded Colonel O'Neill the Bronze Star, noting that the chaplain's prayer had been one of the most important documents of the war. But even with air support, the advance remained brutally difficult. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, 4th Armored Division had covered only 12 miles. They were still 13 miles short of Bastogne. German resistance had stiffened. Every village was a fortress. Every crossroads was defended by anti-tank guns. The bodies of American and German soldiers lay frozen in the snow. Inside Bastogne, the defenders prepared for what they believed would be their final Christmas. Chaplains held services in freezing cellars. Soldiers shared what little food remained. Some sang Christmas carols. Others wrote letters home that they knew would probably never be mailed. Old Blood and Guts spent Christmas Eve visiting frontline units, driving through the darkness to bring personal encouragement to soldiers who were fighting and dying in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. He refused to celebrate Christmas while men under his command were surrounded and fighting for their lives. "Tomorrow," he told his commanders, "we reach Bastogne. I don't care what it costs. We reach Bastogne tomorrow." December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day. 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, made the main thrust. These were hardened veterans in Sherman tanks, supported by infantry and tank destroyers. They had been fighting continuously for 5 days with almost no sleep, pushing forward through German resistance that seemed endless. The village of Assenois stood directly in their path, only 4 miles south of Bastogne. German forces had fortified it heavily. Anti-tank guns covered the approaches. Machine gun nests dominated every intersection. Infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons waited in buildings. Abrams gathered his tank commanders. "We're going straight through," he said simply. "Maximum speed. Don't stop for anything. Bastogne is 4 miles past. At this village. We're getting there today." The attack was pure George Smith Patton doctrine. Violent, aggressive, unstoppable. Abrams' tanks roared forward at maximum speed, guns blazing. They didn't try to clear the village systematically. They punched straight through, crushing German positions, overwhelming defenders with speed and firepower. Infantry followed, mopping up resistance. German soldiers, who had expected a cautious, methodical attack, were stunned by the sheer audacity and violence of the American assault. Assenois fell in less than 2 hours. Now, only 4 miles of open road separated 4th Armored Division from the surrounded garrison in Bastogne. Abrams' lead tanks raced north through the afternoon light. German forces tried to block them. Anti-tank guns fired. Panthers maneuvered into position. Infantry with Panzerfausts emerged from woodlines. The American tanks didn't stop. They fired on the move. They crushed obstacles. When enemy fire disabled lead vehicles, others pushed past them and continued the advance. This was the moment everything had been building toward. 5 days of brutal combat. Thousands of casualties. Hundreds of miles marched through frozen hell. At 16:45 hours, December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead Sherman tank of C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, spotted American positions ahead. Soldiers in different uniforms, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. Boggess stood in his turret and shouted, "Come here! This is the 4th Armored." The paratroopers stared in disbelief. Then they began cheering, shouting, embracing each other. Some fell to their knees and wept. Others fired their weapons into the air in celebration. The siege of Bastogne was broken. George Smith Patton had done the impossible. In 72 hours, he had disengaged 3 divisions from active combat. marched them over 100 miles through the worst winter weather in memory, fought through determined German resistance, and relieved a surrounded garrison that every expert said couldn't be saved. Old Blood and Guts had proven once again that he was the most dangerous man in the United States Army. The narrow corridor that Lieutenant Bogus had punched through to Bastogne was only 300 yards wide. German forces still surrounded the town on 3 sides. Artillery fire continued to rain down. The battle was far from over. But everything had changed. The surrounded garrison now had a lifeline. Supplies began flowing in almost immediately. Ammunition, medical supplies, food. Most importantly, reinforcements. General George Smith Patton arrived in Bastogne on December the 30th, 1944. He drove through the still contested corridor in his open jeep, refusing any armored protection, wanting his soldiers to see him. When he reached the town, he found General McAuliffe coordinating the defense from a basement command post. The two generals shook hands. McAuliffe, exhausted from 10 days of continuous combat, grinned. "General Patton, I'm glad to see you." Old Blood and Guts looked around at the battered town, the exhausted soldiers, the evidence of brutal fighting everywhere. "You've done a magnificent job," Patton said. "Now let's finish these bastards." The German high command was in shock. How had the Americans turned their army around so quickly? How had they punched through German lines that were supposed to be impenetrable? Wehrmacht intelligence officers scrambled to understand what had happened. The answer was standing in a frozen Belgian town, planning his next attack. George Smith Patton. But relieving Bastogne was only the first phase of Patton's plan. Now came the counteroffensive that would destroy the entire German Bulge. Old Blood and Guts wasn't content with defensive victory. He wanted to annihilate the German forces that had dared to attack the United States Army. "Brad," Patton told General Bradley over the phone, "the crowd has stuck his head in a meat grinder, and this time I've got hold of the handle. I'm going to keep turning it until there's nothing left but blood and bones." The German forces trapped in the Bulge were in desperate condition. Their initial offensive had carried them nearly 60 miles into Belgium, but now they were overextended, undersupplied, and facing counterattacks from 3 directions. The fuel shortage that German planners had worried about had become catastrophic. Panzer divisions abandoned tanks and vehicles when they ran out of gasoline. Supply convoys couldn't reach forward units because Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Most crucially, the weather had turned against them. The winter storms that had grounded Allied air power for the first week of the offensive had given way to clear skies. Now, hundreds of Allied fighter bombers prowled the battlefield, attacking anything that moved. German soldiers learned to move only at night. Columns of vehicles were reduced to burning wreckage within minutes of being spotted from the air. George Smith Patton pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. His Third Army, now reinforced to over 7 divisions, attacked northward, squeezing the base of the Bulge. Simultaneously, United States First Army forces attacked from the north. The German salient, which had looked so threatening on December 16th, was now a trap for the forces inside it. The fighting throughout January of 1945 was some of the most savage of the entire Western Front campaign. German forces, recognizing that they faced annihilation, fought with desperate courage. Elite SS divisions launched counterattacks that temporarily pushed back American advances. Wehrmacht infantry defended villages and towns with fanatical determination. Panzer units, despite crippling fuel shortages, positioned their remaining tanks in defensive ambushes that exacted heavy casualties from advancing American armor. But the outcome was never in doubt. George Smith Patton had seized the initiative and would not relinquish it. His operational tempo, the speed at which he planned and executed attacks, was simply too fast for the Germans to counter. While Wehrmacht commanders were still assessing the current situation, Old Blood and Guts was already executing plans for the next phase of operations. One particularly brutal battle exemplified the nature of the fighting. The town of Houffalize, a key road junction in the center of the Bulge, became the objective for converging attacks by Patton's Third Army from the south and First Army from the north. German forces recognized that losing Houffalize would sever their salient completely. For 2 weeks, the battle raged. American infantry attacked through deep snow, clearing German positions one foxhole at a time. Artillery from both sides turned the area into a landscape of craters and shattered trees. Tanks maneuvered cautiously through minefields and ambush positions. Casualties mounted on both sides. Patton visited the front lines constantly, pushing his commanders to maintain pressure. "Don't let them rest," he ordered. "Keep attacking, make them retreat or die." On January 16, 1945, elements of 3rd Army and 1st Army finally met at Houffalize. The Bulge was eliminated. German forces trapped inside were being systematically destroyed or forced to retreat back to their starting positions in Germany. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Hitler's final gamble in the West had failed catastrophically. The casualties were staggering on both sides. The United States Army suffered over 80,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. The 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne alone had lost over 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured during the siege. But the German losses were even more severe and, more importantly, irreplaceable. Over 100,000 German casualties, 700 tanks destroyed, 1,600 aircraft shot down. Entire divisions ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. Most critically, Germany had expended its last strategic reserves in an offensive that accomplished nothing except to hasten their own defeat. German General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of the Western Front, later admitted, "The offensive was a complete failure. We lost men, equipment, and time that we could never recover. And we gave the Americans, particularly General Patton, the opportunity to demonstrate that their army had become a truly formidable fighting force." Another German commander was even more direct. Patton's relief of Bastogne and subsequent offensive operations were the most impressive examples of mobile warfare I witnessed during the entire war. To move an army that distance, in those conditions, and maintain combat effectiveness was something we thought only German forces could accomplish. We were wrong. The legend of Old Blood and Guts reached new heights. Newspapers across the United States proclaimed him a miracle worker. Soldiers who had served under him told stories of his fearless leadership and tactical genius. The pearl-handled pistols, the profane speeches, the open jeep under fire, all became part of American military folklore. But for George Smith Patton himself, the Battle of the Bulge represented something deeper than personal glory. It was vindication of everything he had believed about warfare throughout his career. Aggressive offensive action, speed and violence, personal leadership from the front, absolute confidence in American soldiers' ability to overcome any obstacle. I believe that in war, the good of the individual must be subordinated to the good of the army, Patton wrote in his diary during the battle. But I also believe that a commander who asks his men to die must be willing to share that risk. That's why I go to the front. That's why I stand where the shells are falling. Because my soldiers need to know that their commanding general is not asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. This was the essence of why his soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts and followed him through frozen hell. He asked everything of them, but he gave everything of himself. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bulge and Patton's role in turning potential disaster into decisive victory rippled throughout the remainder of the war. Winston Churchill, addressing the British House of Commons on January 18, 1945, called the battle undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and I believe it will be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. He specifically praised the brilliant leadership of General Eisenhower and his subordinate commanders, particularly General Patton, whose rapid maneuver of forces represented military skill of the highest order. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his official report on the battle, wrote, "The outstanding achievement was the manner in which General Patton's Third Army moved to the relief of Bastogne. The speed of movement and precision of coordination demonstrated that American forces had reached a level of professional military competence equal to any army in the world." Even Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander who was often critical of American military leadership, grudgingly acknowledged Patton's accomplishment. The turning movement of the Third Army was a remarkable feat. It required not only careful planning, but inspired leadership to execute under such difficult conditions. But perhaps the most telling recognition came from captured German officers. Wehrmacht General Fritz Bayerlein, who had fought against Patton in North Africa, Sicily, France, and now in the Ardennes, was interviewed after his capture. His assessment was stark. "We feared Patton above all other Allied commanders. He conducted war according to our own principles: aggressive maneuver, rapid decision-making, personal leadership. When we learned that Patton's Third Army had been moved north to counterattack, we knew the offensive had failed. No other American general could have turned his forces around so quickly and attacked so aggressively. The Battle of the Bulge fundamentally altered the timeline of the war's conclusion. Hitler's decision to commit Germany's remaining reserves to the offensive, rather than using them to defend the Rhine River or the German heartland, meant that subsequent Allied offensives faced significantly less resistance. When George Smith Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine River in March of 1945, they encountered German forces that were shadows of the units that had fought in the Ardennes. The Wehrmacht's ability to conduct sustained defensive operations had been shattered. The road to Berlin, while still requiring months of brutal fighting, was now inevitable. Patton himself recognized the historical significance of what had been accomplished. In a letter to his wife Beatrice, written on January 20th, 1945, he reflected on the battle. The relief of Bastogne was the most difficult military operation I have ever conducted, not because of the enemy, though they fought well, but because of the conditions. Moving an army in winter, under constant attack, while maintaining the offensive spirit. This tested everything I have learned in 40 years of studying war. That we succeeded is a testament not to my genius, but to the courage and professionalism of the American soldier. They are the finest fighting men in the world, and it has been my honor to lead them. But old blood and guts being old blood and guts, he couldn't resist adding, of course, it didn't hurt to have a commander who understood that audacious action trumps cautious defense every single time. The soldiers who fought under Patton during those desperate weeks carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Veterans of the relief operation spoke with pride about being part of Georgie's miracle. Men who had been trapped in Bastogne spoke with reverence about the moment when they saw 4th Armored Division's tanks breaking through. One 101st Airborne veteran recalled, "We had been fighting for days with no ammunition, no food, no medical supplies. We thought we were going to die in that frozen town. Then we heard someone shout that Patton's tanks were coming. We didn't quite believe it until we saw them with our own eyes. Sherman tanks with that big white star, and tankers shouting that old blood and guts had sent them to get us out. I've never been so happy to see anything in my entire life." A 4th Armored Division tank commander remembered, "We drove those tanks for 5 straight days, barely sleeping, barely eating. Just fighting forward because General Patton told us those paratroopers were depending on us. When we finally broke through to Bastogne and those airborne guys started cheering and crying, that's when I understood why we do what we do. That's when I understood why Patton pushed us so hard. He knew what was at stake better than we did." The United States military has studied Patton's relief of Bastogne at staff colleges and war colleges ever since. It remains a textbook example of rapid force projection, aggressive offensive operations under adverse conditions, and the importance of commanders' intent in decentralized operations. Modern military analysts point to several key factors that made the operation successful. First, preparation. Patton's staff had anticipated the possibility of a German offensive and prepared contingency plans. When the crisis came, they didn't need to start from scratch. They executed pre-planned operations with modifications. Second, command. Culture. The Third Army had developed a culture of aggressive action under Patton's leadership. Subordinate commanders understood what their general expected and were empowered to make decisions that aligned with his intent without waiting for detailed orders. Third, logistics mastery. Moving over 130,000 vehicles over icy roads while maintaining fuel and ammunition supplies required logistical expertise that matched the tactical brilliance. Fourth, personal leadership. George Smith Patton's presence at the front, sharing his soldiers' dangers and hardships, created morale and determination that overcame physical exhaustion and brutal conditions. But perhaps the most important lesson was the one that old blood and guts had preached his entire career. In warfare, the side that attacks, that seizes initiative, that forces the enemy to react rather than act, holds the decisive advantage. The Germans had attacked first on December 16th, but George Smith, Patton had seized the initiative on December 22nd, and he never relinquished it. Segment 6. The Legend, 22-25 minutes. The story of how General George Smith Patton turned the Germans' greatest offensive into their most catastrophic defeat became central to his legend, and what a legend it was. Old Blood and Guts would continue leading Third Army through the final months of the war. He crossed the Rhine, he drove deep into Germany, he liberated concentration camps and witnessed horrors that shook even his warrior's soul. He was preparing for potential operations against the Soviet Union when the war in Europe ended in May of 1945. His life after the war was tragically short. A car accident in December of 1945 left him paralyzed. He died on December 21st, 1945, almost exactly 1 year after he had attended the Verdun conference that set the relief of Bastogne in motion. But his legacy endures. George Smith Patton remains one of the most studied, admired, and controversial military commanders in United States history. His tactical brilliance is undeniable. His personal courage was legendary. His ability to inspire soldiers to accomplish the impossible was unmatched. The Battle of the Bulge, and specifically the relief of Bastogne, represents Patton at his finest. Everything that made him great as a commander came together in those desperate December days of 1944. The aggressive spirit, the meticulous planning, the personal leadership, the absolute confidence that American soldiers could defeat any enemy anywhere. When the Germans launched their offensive, they were laughing at the trapped Americans in Bastogne. They thought victory was assured. The weather favored them. Surprise was complete. The odds were overwhelmingly in their favor. Then George Smith Patton said 2 words, "Play ball," and everything changed. The impossible became possible. The trapped became liberated. The defeated became victorious. 10,000 soldiers who should have died or been captured went home to their families after the war because Old Blood and Guts refused to accept that their relief was impossible. Historians still debate various aspects of Patton's career, his political views, his controversies, his relationships with other commanders. But when it comes to the Battle of the Bulge, there is no debate. His performance was masterful, period. The United States Army's official history of the battle concludes, General Patton's relief of Bastogne stands as one of the finest examples of operational art in American military history. The speed, precision, and aggressiveness of Third Army's operations from December 19th through 26th represent military leadership of the highest order. Modern military commanders still study what Patton did. They analyze his planning process. They examine how he maintained momentum despite brutal conditions. They learn from his command style and his ability to inspire soldiers to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But the most important lesson from George Smith Patton's relief of Bastogne isn't really about military tactics or operational planning. It's about leadership. It's about what happens when a commander absolutely believes in his soldiers and makes them believe in themselves. Old Blood and Guts believed that American soldiers could do anything if properly led and motivated. He proved it in the frozen hell of the Ardennes in December of 1944. He proved it by turning a potential catastrophe into the greatest United States victory of the war in Europe. The Germans stopped laughing after Bastogne. They learned what the rest of the world was beginning to understand. The United States Army, led by commanders like George Smith Patton, was the most powerful military force on Earth. And at the heart of that force was a general who wore pearl-handled pistols, delivered profanity-laced speeches, believed he had fought in ancient battles, and led from the front no matter how dangerous it became. They called him Old Blood and Guts for good reason. He gave his blood, he showed his guts, and he asked his soldiers to do the same. In the end, that's why 10,000 men survived Bastogne. That's why Hitler's final gamble failed. That's why the war in Europe ended with German defeat and Allied victory. Because when it mattered most, when everything hung in the balance, General George Smith Patton did what he always did. He attacked. If this story of how Old Blood and Guts saved 10,000 lives and destroyed Hitler's final offensive moved you, if you want to hear more incredible stories of General George Smith Patton's legendary military career, hit that subscribe button right now. We're bringing you more untold moments from the greatest combat commander in United States history. The man who never accepted defeat. The man who turned impossible situations into inevitable victories. The general who proved that, with bold leadership and unwavering courage, American soldiers can accomplish anything. Subscribe now. because the legend of Old Blood and Guts is far from over.